Hello everyone, my name is Steven and I'm the Director of Education here for Beyond Education Consulting, here to talk to you a little bit today about why are SAT scores sometimes so challenging to predict. This is a question that I've gotten from families and students, typically about the more recent SAT, the 2024 overhauled version, and of course beyond, so that's really what we're referring to today. So let's go ahead and dive right on in as far as why SAT scores can be a little bit challenging to predict these days. So there are four primary reasons that SAT scores can be a little up and a little down, and sometimes a little more so in either case than we would expect. So first and foremost, this has been the case for the last 10 years more, frankly, and as long as I've been teaching SAT, there have always been scaling patterns, or what's sometimes referred to as a curve, from exam to exam. Now, one thing to go ahead and note is that where sometimes students refer to this as a curve, it's not technically a curve because the scale is actually something determined before each exam is ever proctored. And this will mean that sometimes students who get maybe 4 questions wrong on a given exam will lose 50 points, and sometimes the same 4 questions will then cost them 70 points. It'll really vary from exam to exam because of the scale applied to each test. Now, as far as why the College Board does this, they're trying to equate any one exam proctored throughout the year with any other. So for example, a student who takes an SAT in March, likes their score and feels good about it, well, that has to be equated to the student who takes their test over in August, several months later, and gets maybe the exact same score. In other words, we have to be able to hold those two scores as equal to each other. But how do we do that knowing that several months have passed and the exams are going to be completely different? Well, that's again where the scale comes in. As far as the College Board is concerned, it makes both those tests equal to each other. In fact, what we call scaling, the College Board often calls equating. So this is something that's been going on for more than a decade, and unfortunately there's no way to know how the scales will change from exam to exam. I sometimes get a follow-up question from parents asking, well, when are going to be the easy scales and when are the more difficult scales? The truth is that there's not generally a pattern that's been established for those particular scenarios. As far as what an easy or hard scale means, just to be clear, it would refer to what I mentioned a moment ago. Missing 4 questions takes off 50 points versus missing 4 questions takes off 70 points. The first would be called an easy scale, the second would be called a hard scale. And once more, there's really no way to know what kind of scale we'll be getting. There's a little bit more we can say on this in a minute, but let's continue on for now. The next reason is questions are weighted. So this is actually a new development since 2024, but questions are now weighted on the SAT across the entirety of the exam. And we're still learning a lot more about what the weighting picture actually looks like. In other words, how the College Board is actually weighting things. We can use some of the mock exam materials that the College Board has released to learn a little bit about what this can look like, but the test itself is still too big to know for sure exactly how the weighting is set up. Here's some of the things we know initially. Number one, don't miss easy questions. Easy questions appear to count for more points in general, not always, but in general, than hard questions. And hard questions are still necessary to get right as well for the really top scores, but we really can't afford to miss any easy questions initially, and then we'll have to work our way up to getting all the hard questions right later on. Free response questions in the math portion of the test seem to be very critical as well. And this makes a bit of sense, I think, because the free response questions don't lend themselves to some of the strategy or some of the, frankly, luck that multiple choice questions do. With multiple choice, we can sometimes guess and simply get the question right, and it's going to give us just the same number of points as if we actually knew what we were doing. And furthermore, multiple choice questions, because they give us a variety of possibly correct answers, well, there's some strategy, some game that we can apply to those questions to get them correct, even if we're maybe not so caught up on our math concepts. In other words, we use less math sometimes and more just a bit of logical deduction to figure out what question, or rather what answer, ends up being correct. Well, free response questions don't lend themselves to either of those strategies or either of those scenarios, so they are going to be weighted a little bit more. So again, we're still learning more about this, but again, depending upon what your student is missing from test to test, that can have an impact on the scores and therefore make them difficult to predict. The next element, this is something that is also totally new for 2024, or at least it's kind of a return maybe for 2024 from older SATs, vocabulary, everyone's favorite. The reading and writing modules typically have 5 to 7 what are called word and context questions that really test directly on vocabulary. Now, why is that a problem, or why can it be challenging when it comes to our final scores? Well, the fact is most students are not studying vocabulary actively in their schools or in their personal lives. Vocabulary is something that first and foremost is very difficult to build up and retain in a short time frame. So for any students who are actively studying for the SAT or preparing for the exam, well, the challenge is that the SAT's word bank is massive. We're talking thousands of potential words, and it's just very difficult to build reliably a student's vocabulary bank up to such levels ahead of their exam. Assuming you're looking for a really top score, assuming you're looking for no rattle, no wobble within the numbers, the ability to know every single word that could possibly show up on test day, very, very difficult. And as I mentioned earlier, most students are not actively pursuing vocabulary within their language arts studies. And that's just due to changes in curricula over the years. If you are listening to this currently and you have a sophomore, freshman, or even a middle school student whom you believe will eventually be taking the SAT, I would say get on a regular rote vocabulary building program right now. Something you can do at home, daily, weekly. You've got time on your side, so make sure you're studying vocabulary if you don't want this challenge to be such a challenge later on. There is one additional vocabulary challenge as well. Later on in the reading passages, there may be, in more difficult passages, jargon or very complex or sophisticated vocabulary that shows up that may also challenge students. In other words, they are no longer being asked simply what a word means, they are now expected to know what it means within a larger context. And that can also sometimes stymie students where they simply didn't anticipate seeing the vocabulary that they are in that moment, and so they don't really know so well what is going on in a given passage, and that then makes their comprehension lower, their answering of questions a little bit more of a guess, and that can really throw off scores depending upon when it happens, where it happens, and how much those questions are worth. So again, vocabulary in two very different ways is making SAT scores a little challenging to predict. Next, module transitions. This is the last reason. This is also new for 2024. Basically, the test has become a modular or adaptive exam. So what that means is that Module 1 is the same for all students, and yet then we have a choice or a scenario, sort of a chance, let's say, to go to a harder or an easier Module 2. Now, typically what this means for students is that if you are doing around 70%, getting around 70% correct in Module 1, well then you're likely going to the harder version of Module 2. And if you're getting below 70% correct within Module 1, you're likely going to the easier Module 2. But what we're finding is that the easy Module 2 is kind of excessively easy, whereas the harder Module 2 is a little excessively hard. Now, this might change in the future as the College Board learns more about the exam that they're building in terms of student performance. They're likely going to be sort of working on the dials of difficulty and making it so that Module 2, in terms of the big jump, the harder jump, is not such a massive change, whereas the easy jump down to Module 2 is maybe not as easy as it currently is. But at the moment, we're seeing very lopsided performances where a student might do well in Module 1 and they get frankly kind of crushed by Module 2, or they may do kind of poorly in Module 1, but then in Module 2 they do phenomenally because again, it's just too easy. This again means a stark transition in terms of difficulty. Considering the vocabulary and the weighting of questions and the scaling that we mentioned earlier, this will also kind of be a confounding factor when it comes to predicting SAT scores. So for any student who is currently preparing for the SAT and seeing their Module 1 scores improving, well, if you suddenly see your Module 2 just completely collapse, that's perfectly normal. It's the case where you're probably doing so well in Module 1 that now Module 2 has kind of been triggered into the harder version of itself, and you are seeing a very, again, stark contrast in terms of difficulty. So, for all those 4 reasons, SAT scores are now more difficult than ever to confidently predict from exam to exam. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no hope and there's nothing that we should really be doing actively or thinking about. In fact, it just means there's more things that we have to go ahead and actively think about and anticipate. For all test preparation or academic needs, please reach out to us with your questions or concerns. Again, my name is Stephen, and as the Director of Education here, I've been working with SAT and ACT content for more than 12 years. I'm happy to answer your questions or see what makes the most sense for your son or daughter when it comes to preparing for their exam, but go ahead and reach out to us online or give us a call today. There's our website info in the background. We're hoping to hear from you soon. Thanks so much for your time.